Go ahead and do slideshow. Everybody see that okay?
Yes.
All right. So, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about uh, Texas horn lizards and how to restore them, how to restore their populations, their food web, their habitat, mostly using native plants. And we're going to start off taking kind of a look at what has happened to horn lizards over the last couple hundred years, and using an historic lens to explore that. And then we're going to go into uh, what we can do about what's happened. This is about 60, 65 slides or so. So I'm going to try to go uh, into a fairly deep dive here without being too, you know, academic, uh, uh, using too many uh, uh, lingo that anybody can understand, basically. Um, and so, oh, let me go back to this first slide. Um, this is a painting by John James Audubon, his white heron that he included in the book that he released in, I think, about roughly 1840 or so, of the birds of North America. And in the book, he talks about having seen these birds from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way to Galveston. So he came to Texas and visited Galveston in 1837. He saw these birds there. This is where I grew up. I lived just a few minutes walk from Galveston Bay in Galveston County, and some of the sites in this image are familiar. I saw the crawdad chimneys that you see there on the ground. In the background, you see some kind of perhaps coastal prairie grass, maybe switchgrass or eastern gamma grass, something like that. But in the foreground, that caught my attention was this horn lizard that he had engraved uh, on the lower left part of the image. Um, I thought this is very interesting because the two main places that he talks about in his book, seeing these birds, was South Carolina, and where there are no horn lizards, and Texas, where there were horn lizards. And he visited Sam Houston when Texas was a republic, that spring of 1837 in April and May. Um, and I like to think he would have seen horn lizards because they would have been very common, um, especially at that time of year. And so, I am 44 years old. I never saw a horned lizard. I'm old enough. Well, I'm young enough, even though I'm 44, to have never seen a horned lizard, even though I grew up in Texas until I was in my, let's see, I was 27 years old. And I grew up in this place where perhaps Audubon saw them, but I know for certain my parents, my friends' parents, my grandparents, aunts and uncles, others saw horned lizards where I grew up. They were there just one generation before, lots of them. And I essentially, my first horned lizards that I saw were like in movies, like The Living Desert or Old Yeller, these feature-length movies from 19 Disney in the 1940s and 1950s. And I basically wanted to be this kid from from the Old Yeller film because for one reason, because I was so jealous of him. He had horned lizards in his yard, just like my parents had, just like my grandparents had, in Texas and Oklahoma. And me being somebody who was just fascinated with reptiles from an early age, from basically before I was old enough to walk, that I can remember, uh, I was completely jealous of this kid. Um, and and so at the time when Old Yeller was released, that was December 1957. Uh, there's a legend that Walt Disney himself visited Texas to promote the film, but to give a couple private viewings to the author Fred Gibson of Mason, Texas, and friends and family, and so on, and that Walt Disney visited there, and as I was looking into this story, I was finding these old newspaper articles about the visit in Mason. And my best friend here, Chris Ramos, from graduate school, is holding a young Texas horn lizard in his hand there, who went out and did research with me at TCU, where I did my master's on Texas horn lizards camouflage. Um, it turns out his grandmother was one of the young girls in attendance at this private viewing of Old Yeller. Just a funny coincidence as I was researching all this. Um, but at the time that this was happening, that Old Yeller was being released, horn lizards were so ubiquitous across the landscape in Texas. I mean, they were just, when you talk to people who saw them in decades prior, it was like, yeah, we collected them by the shoebox full. They were everywhere. You could go out and find them anytime you wanted to. But just 10 years after Old Yeller was released, uh, the the Texas Senate released passed a bill to protect the Texas horn lizards. Senate Bill number 331, and you can see it here, but it didn't allow the killing or the capture, the selling, or the transporting of horn lizards within the state of Texas. And also, it also protected the Texas tortoise. This was September 1967, not even 10 years after horn lizards were so common that kids were selling them almost like they sell soda pop bottles for extra spending money during their summer vacation. And just in 10 years' time, they were wiped out from a number of communities, especially across the eastern half of the state. And so, like I say, what was happening? Well, you hear a lot of the stories that kids were selling them. Like I mentioned, Boy Scouts were trading them at jamborees. You see this young gentleman here on the left. He's got a horn lizard in his hand here, showing these other Boy Scouts at the National Jamboree in Valley Forge in 1950. And you could find in the newspapers wanted ads for buying horn lizards and selling them for as much as 89 cents a piece and buying them for as little as 10 cents a piece. But that's just one story of what happened to the horn lizard. I think the story goes back a lot further than that. I think it goes back as far back as the Great Plow-Up, when we started to the European settlers started to plow up the prairie grasses of the Great Plains, and also with the annihilation of what has been called, the American Serengeti and its large animals. And so, in trying to understand how to restore horned lizards, I think it's important to understand what was their historic habitat like before we came here, and it was essentially this. It was this American Serengeti. The author Dan Flores, if you've heard of him and read his book with the same title here, was able to elucidate to the reader what this looked like. But it was, when the early explorers came across the plains, Lewis and Clark, Audubon himself, they were just gobsmacked at the number of large megafauna that they saw. From horizon to horizon, they could see thousands of bison, pronghorn, wolves on their flanks or on their heels, as many as a dozen or a couple dozen wolves at any time, when you saw a few hundred to a few thousand bison. And it reminded these early explorers of the velds of South Africa or the Masai Mara, where you could see large grazers being followed by large top-tier carnivores. and these expansive grasslands. And so that's essentially what it was. And that was the cradle of existence for Texas horned lizards. And before that, 10,000 years before that, there were lots more large megafauna. You had mammoths in Texas, you had giant sloths, and a lot of other large genera of mammals. And they would have been dodging the footsteps of these things and living amongst them for a long time. The earliest known Texas horned lizard fossils go back to the Pliocene, which was about 2.5 million to 5 million years ago. And so they've been here a long time. They've been coexisting with a lot of large creatures for a long time. And the movements of these large megafauna likely allowed the dispersal of Texas horned lizards. You've heard of buffalo traces or bison traces. There's even a whiskey called Buffalo Trace. When bison and other large creatures were migrating across the plains, they created these paths, these game traces, and that created trodden, grazed down, short plants in those areas, and with a lot of interstitial bare ground in between these short plants. And just adjacent to these bison traces, you had taller, ungrazed grasses and weeds and forbs and so forth. And this was perfect for a lot of this was perfect microhabitat for a lot of the smaller terrestrial vertebrates that need to run on open ground in the Great Plains, like roadrunners and box turtles and quails and horned lizards, coach-whip snakes, hognose snakes, and so on. And especially for the reptiles, it allowed them to quickly thermoregulate, shuffling in between these two grazed areas and the ungrazed areas just adjacent to them. And of course, bison carried some of the prairie grass seeds in their fur and transported those seeds across not just the plains, but into the tall grass prairie and across the Mississippi River all the way to the eastern seaboard when Columbus landed. And so if you look at a lot of these early records from Lewis and Clark, when they sent the first animal that they found when they started their expedition from St. Louis, well, the first animal that they acquired was a Texas horned lizard. They acquired it from the Osage Indians in Kansas, and they sent it back east to President Thomas Jefferson. Well, when they were inquired about the habitat of this horned lizard, they said, well, it came from these small ground squirrels that bark, and so it was prairie dogs. But when Thomas Jefferson received that lizard, he sent it to his museum curator friend Charles Wilson Peale. A few years later, Peale's own son, Titian Ramsey Peale, went out on an expedition of his own with the Stephen Long expedition in 1820. Zebulon Pike of Pike's Peak fame went out in, I think, 1808 to the Great Plains as well. All of these explorers, when they saw Texas horned lizards, they saw the community that they were with, and every single time they were in prairie dog towns. And it's known that prairie dog towns support something like 200 different species of vertebrates, and there's even a plant species named after prairie dogs. I think 4 known plant species depend on prairie dog towns in some way or another. And so clearly there was a community of assemblage of this, prairie diorama that supported horned lizards. And so what else was happening to horned lizards besides, young kids over collecting them and selling them to gas station owners for the pet and curio trade and so forth? Well, you had during late 1800s and early 1900s, the USDA was funding agents to go, and Aldo Leopold, I'm sure that name is familiar to most, if not all of you. He was one of those employed by the federal government to go and kill kill wildness, kill wolves off, kill mountain lions and bears, um, and essentially all of this wildness of the Great Plains in the western United States was being it was in the way. It was in the way of agriculture and manifest destiny, and it was being commodified. Things are being killed for their tongues and their pelts, and just killed because they were essentially in the way. And Vernon Bailey, who has a peak in Big Bend National Park named after him, and also the Mexican wolf is Canis lupus bailey is named after him. He was an employee of the USDA's Bureau of Biological Survey in the early 1900s, and he released a series of circulars that you could buy at feed stores, and this is one of them: the directions for the destruction of wolves and their cubs. And it basically was propaganda for how to kill off all this wildness. And they did a lot of these pamphlets that you could buy, and some of them were about killing prairie dogs and pocket gophers, both of which are keystone species that support many different other vertebrates around their burrows, including Texas horn lizards. Texas horn lizards are known to occur around prairie dog towns and pocket gopher burrows communities more than on adjacent areas without those two rodents. And so this is just a table that I put together of some of these keystone species of the Great Plains, and their numbers before European settlement and their numbers post-European settlement. And so you have bison that were about 27 to 30 million, about 5 million of which were in Texas in 1800, and about the span of one human's lifetime, 84 years later, there were less than 1,000. I think less than 5 were in Texas and were rescued by Charles Goodnight. And then pronghorn went from 15 million in 1820 down to 13,000 just 80 years later. Prairie dogs, about an estimated, who knows, 5 billion, down to less than maybe a billion 100 years later. Elk, 10 million to 100,000, wild horses, and so on. So prairie wolves went, which is a species of wolf, a subspecies of wolf, were extirpated in the 1920s. So you can see that a lot of these things that actually build horned lizard habitat, and they do it free of charge. All the stuff that we're trying to do to restore horned lizards, and it costs us money, and we have to get out and sweat and plant seeds and so forth. All these species are known to kind of do that without any of our help. And so another thing, is suppressing the wildfires. We know that indigenous communities use fires for centuries, if not longer, to attract bison to the new fresh growths of grasses, and they used it for agriculture, for pests and all sorts of reasons. But they essentially managed the land for thousands of years and coexisted with all of these other species that we sort of extirpated in the 1800s and going into the 1920s. And we know that fires promote biodiversity because of the way that they create these grassland mosaics. You can have dominant grasses in the unburned areas right next to some less dominant species of grasses and forbs that will grow where it was just burned, and so they can kind of have their moment adjacent to it. And so you get more diversity in a region or a patch. And then also the introduction of domestic livestock, and domestic livestock, of course, replaced wild bovines like bison, and this is just an interesting map because it shows the number of cattle brands per county in 1865, and you can see there are hundreds of brands already registered in Bexar County and Medina County around this time, and fences were starting to be used, and the take home message here is just what effect would this all of these brands and all these cattle concentrated in one place have had on grazing and erosion, and the native plant communities. And so, of course, we know that that prairie grasses were killed off. This is an article from the Gainesville, Texas Daily Register on the left in 1949, demonstrating this new Bermuda grass sprig planter that could plant, I think it was 2 acres an hour, Bermuda grass sprigs, and then just a few months later, or a year later, in April 1950, Bermuda grass supplies were being sold out in Texas due to the high demand. And so these were exotic grasses that replaced the prairie grasses, the bunch grasses. And this is just a map from the Texas Landscape Project, showing where a lot of these exotic grasses came from. Many of them from Africa, most of them in the first half of the 1900s, and coming into Texas there. And also, looking at red imported fire ants, they first came into Texas in 1958 in that dark orange section over there in the big thicket along the coast. And by a little more than 10 years ago, they had already reached all these other counties there, except for some of the ones in the Trans-Pecos and the Panhandle. And those have been implicated in the destruction of certain terrestrial vertebrates like quails and horned lizards and box turtles and others. And so in response to this fire ant problem, the USDA purchased hundreds of millions of dollars worth of an insecticide called Myrex, which just a brand name that translates literally to ant exterminator. And this was in the 1960s, 1970s. It was eventually banned by the EPA in 1978, and they had spread it, dropping it from airplanes all over the eastern half of Texas through that time. And even though the USDA promised that this would get rid of the fire ant problem, it didn't. And it actually allegedly reduced a lot of the native ant and termite populations, including some of the ants that are known to be really important in the diet of Texas horned lizards. All right, and also just development, whether agricultural or commercial or residential. There's two little stories embedded within these images here. On the left, there's a wanted ad from the Brownsville, Texas Daily Herald in 1909. And it's a wanted ad for 10,000 horned lizards. And it says, a gentleman from Brownsville is inquiring whether 10,000 horned lizards can be secured. And it says, what I find interesting is this middle part here. It says, the rate at which this section has been cleared of brush for agricultural purposes of late has probably lessened the number of horned toads here. But small kids, boys might find it remunerative to devote part of their summer vacation to the task of catching those that are left. This is in 1909, so I think it's amazing that the agriculture had already cleared off some of the horned lizard habitat even then in that area. And then this is on the right, some aerial photos of eastern Fort Worth in the 1970s, where there was a prairie dog town, and there were horned lizards there. Where East Loop 820 and Martin Luther King Jr. Freeway intersect. And so it's now a business park. The prairie dogs were removed and sent back somewhere else. Certainly there's no more horned lizards left anywhere in Fort Worth anymore. And just an example from my own childhood. Like I said, I grew up in Galveston County. This is the house over here that I moved into as a teenager in the early 90s. And this is a Google Earth image from 1987. And my brother, when we moved into this house just in the 90s, this 40-acre section in the middle here had horned lizards in it. And I was a teenager. I was too busy doing other things, but he didn't tell me about it till years later that he found horned lizards in this coastal prairie remnant that was this 40-acre section here. Um, and this was confirmed through similar habitat in around the area, through friends and my high school science teacher. Um, and they were there as late as the mid to late 90s, and then this is what it looked like in 2004. They built it up, and that's what it looks like today. So there's, as far as I know, there's no more horned lizards left in Galveston County or Houston or anywhere, hardly anywhere east of I-35. And we'll get to more of that in a second. So what happened to all those exotic grasses? Well, some of them that you can see here that I just pulled from maps off of iNaturalist. There's Bermuda grass on the top left over there. That's known to be an invasive species, as I'm sure you guys know. Buffalo grass is causing a lot of ecological problems in South Texas over there. And then you got Bahia grass in the eastern half of Texas, forming dense monocultures. KR blue stem, or Johnson grass is next, and then KR blue stem. You can see a pattern here. Most of these grasses seem to be located where our biggest metroplexes are: DFW, San Antonio, Austin, Houston. But overall, they seem to be concentrated in the eastern half of the state. And so it kind of makes sense when we look at the current range of horned lizards in a moment here, why the grass distributions of exotic grasses might have an effect on that as well. And so on the left here is a map of the historic grasslands as they were thought to be in Texas pre-settlement. And so you can see Texas was mostly grasslands except for the piney woods and Tamaulipan thorn scrub, and some of that habitat along the Pecos River. It was mostly grasslands. And on the image on the right, the turquoise is all that's left of intact grasslands in Texas now. It's the largest prairie state with the least amount of protected prairie. And so that coastal prairie went looking like this image on the left. I'm a herper, so I had to pick a picture with a snake in the foreground. That's a speckled king snake. To this image over here on the right. So you have, this is basically what every yard in Texas City looked like in Galveston County when I was a kid in the 80s. Looked like it had Chinese tallow trees with monoculture of St. Augustine turf. And that was about it. And so just as an aside, on social media and other outlets, there's this sort of pervasive thing that folks are saying that I am so glad that horned lizards are making a comeback. Well, I think that stems from some articles that have come out with exactly that title. These two articles that you see on the left and center here in the last couple of years that have come out. And when you look at why they say they're making a comeback, they're talking about the efforts that the zoos are making to breed them in captivity and release them in areas, which is laudable and very exciting. And the people working on these projects are friends of mine, and I applaud what they're doing. It's creating so much excitement, but it's perhaps misleading to say it's a comeback, I think, because we don't have any evidence, I don't think, that there's that the rate of restoration is exceeding the rate of destruction or the rate of local extinctions that's still going on. And just one example to kind of throw at my point here is the city of Kennedy, Texas, in Karnes County, is the self-proclaimed horned lizard capital of Texas. You see this billboard as soon as you drive into town. This is one of the areas where, when I was doing my master's at TCU, we surveyed the horned lizard populations there, and Professor Dean Williams, I think, surveyed them for about close to 10 years. By the time I got there in 2017, the effective population size, in other words, the number of breeding horned lizards in the city of Kennedy was 4, according to his genetic studies. And by the time that I graduated in 2019, the effective population size was 0. So essentially, the horned-toed capital of Texas is population of horned lizards are 0, extinct. And I just using that as an example because I think that situation is continuously playing out in a number of communities where horned lizards have been the past few years, and they're still kind of winking out in a lot of places, I believe. And so where were Texas horned lizards and where are they now? As I mentioned before, those game traces or bison buffalo traces probably allowed them to disperse into the thickest parts of the tallgrass prairie. There's records of Texas horned lizards in southwestern Missouri from the 1930s. There haven't been any in a long time. Even some in Louisiana and Arkansas. But this translucent pink area here is their historic range. All of the solid red dots are constitute their current range. So you can see that there's a big chunk on the eastern side where horned lizards used to be just a few decades ago and are no longer. And so this is just the same data, but with I-35 drawn across it, so you can see that they're practically gone from east of the interstate corridor. And again, this is data from Texas Parks and Wildlife, where biologists were in every county were reporting whether they had seen horned lizards or not. All the green counties were places where none of the biologists saw horned lizards, and the tan ones or the yellow ones were some of the biologists saw horned lizards, but not all of them. And all the chocolate colored counties, every single Texas Parks and Wildlife biologist saw a horned lizard on their surveys. And so there's this, you can see with this, what I like about this map is that you can see this kind of chipping away, where the tan counties are of horned lizards starting to kind of disappear in this westward direction, right? And it makes sense when you consider that the tall grass prairie is the most endangered ecosystem on the planet, according to some ecologists. The mid-grass prairie is endangered as well, but there's more of that. And then the short grass prairie, which is in the western part of the state, has more intact than either of those. And to me, you don't have to invoke fire ants or Boy Scouts or any of that stuff. You can just look at how much habitat is left to see that what's going on. That these are a prairie species, and that if you got less than 1% tallgrass prairie in the eastern third of Texas, why would you have a prairie species like Texas horned lizard still hanging on? So, bringing this to where you guys are in Salado, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Were they ever in Bell County?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. Folks are saying yes, yes, and we can confirm that with data. You can see the dot over here. This is the map from Jim Dixon's Amphibians and Reptiles of Texas book, showing a dot for Bell County. And as you zoom in on some of the museum records for Texas horned lizards in Bell County and surrounding areas, you can see, yeah, that they were there. My dad in the 1950s was a kid in College Station. He said he saw them in his yard there. You can see them around Temple, Killeen. And there's this book, the Atlas, the Interpretive Atlas of Texas Lizards, came out in 1996. And this entire book just has all species of Texas lizards and their museum locality records. And so this is for Bell County for Texas horned lizards. Phrynosoma cornutum is the Texas horned lizard Latin binomial. And and so we can see some actual addresses in here and places where Texas horned lizards were found in Bell County. You can see Sugarloaf School in Killeen, and let's see, Emerson Elementary School down here in Temple, 1813 South 41st Street in Temple, and so forth. Then you got some others that are a little bit less descriptive. So you've got a 10 miles southwest on a dirt road. But then over here on the right column is some kind of descriptive information as well that I think is useful. the acronym there is the museum or the university of where the specimen is housed, usually in ethanol. Sometimes they're stuffed. And then the 2-digit numbers is the year that they were found. And these are all the 1900s, of course. And so, so you can kind of see this what's happened in Bell County. They kind of tapered off in the late 1960s. The population of horned lizards there. Okay, so what can we do about all this? My coming into this, I worked for Native American Seed for a couple of years after I did my master's at TCU, and that might be considered an unusual path for somebody who's interested in reptiles primarily, since I was a kid. But the reason is because I read this book in 2010 by Douglas Tallamy, who's an entomologist who studies the relationship between plants and insects. And what he's found overwhelmingly is that native plants are what you need to support practically all wildlife, terrestrial wildlife communities, and freshwater aquatic communities, because insects form so much of the food web. I mean, practically all songbirds, doesn't matter if they grow up to eat seeds as an adult, like a cardinal or something like that, they're fed insects when they're hatchlings by their parents because they're so high in fat and protein and helpful for growing those tissues of those young hatchling birds. Practically all amphibians are insectivores. Most reptiles at some stage of their life eat insects, if not all of their life. And of course, we know that they're responsible for pollinating all of these flowers that we enjoy and that the rest of nature enjoys. Insects are like E.O. Wilson said, the little things that run the world. And so this book was really influential for helping me understand, if I want to see horned lizards like the kid in Old Yeller saw, my parents saw, then this is the solution. We're going to have to use the native plants to recreate the food web and the habitat of any particular any species that you want to help that species exist. And so that was kind of what caught me on fire and gave me a purpose when it comes to all this. And so another thing we can do is kind of go to places where it seems like things are still going right. And this is a scene from Brewster County out in Big Bend from just a few years ago when I visited the grasslands there north of Marathon that the Nature Conservancy manages. There's several keystone species there in this grassland in Brewster County, and we walked up to the barbed wire fence along the side of the road there and looked out, and you could see pronghorn. You see that pronghorn buck out in the distance, and in the foreground we could see prairie dogs and their burrows, and then I looked down at my feet in front of the barbed wire fence, and I saw. So there's more of the prairie dog activity there out in a few yards out past that the fence there. And then when I looked down at my feet, I saw a horned lizard scat. Now I broke it open, and you can see some ant pieces in there, but actually a lot of beetle pieces. But it was definitely a horned lizard scat, and I'll show you what a horned lizard fecal pellet looks like in a few minutes. But it was kind of like this aha moment, because this area is one of the most reliable places to go out and find Texas horned lizards in the Trans-Pecos. And I think it does have something to do with the fact that it's one of the few places where you can go find prairie dogs out in the Trans-Pecos reliably. And one of the few places where you can see pronghorn antelope frolicking around. And so I think there's something to that with this prairie community, that they support each other. And they build the community that they need for each member, each species to exist. And there is, other small native grazers that seem to be important, as I mentioned before. Pocket gophers. These are pocket gopher mounds in South Texas, and research from Jessica Light and I think Toby Hibbets at A&M shows that Texas horned lizards do use these probably for laying eggs and and just burrowing into the soil when they need to escape the elements. And grasshoppers are known to be the pound for pound the most intense grazers of the prairie. They eat more grasses than bison or cows. And so, we have this tendency to, as Western humans, to want to select for grasses that have the quickest return on investment. They have shallow roots. They invest a lot in either horizontal spread or in seeds quickly. And so, one example is the turf grass there. Maybe it's St. Augustine, something like that. Or on the left on this image. I'm sure all of you, being native plant enthusiasts, have seen this picture before. But your native bunch grasses have a different strategy. They stay put. They're kind of clump shaped. There's more there's less problems with erosion whenever there's a drought and that kind of thing, because their roots are so strong and they cling to that soil. And they don't invest so much in horizontal spread through rhizomes and such. There's more bare soil in between the root crowns of the grass clumps. And that's better for the community of small terrestrial vertebrates like horned lizards to be able to get around, and other reasons. Another reason that prairie grasses seem to be important for Texas horned lizards is that they're camouflaged. And so this is what I studied for my master's thesis at TCU, is looking at digital photographs of horned lizards exactly as they were found without touching them, and measuring to see if what components of their background they camouflage to. And so and it turns out that they basically are highly matched to their local soil color. If you're in the red soils of the rolling plains, the horny toads there are red. If you're in the charcoal colored gumbo soils of East Texas, the lizards there are charcoal or gray colored. The ones in alpine, where you have brown kind of volcanic igneous soils and rocks, the Texas horned lizards there are brown. So and so on. And and then there's this this behavior that horned lizards do. They can only do it on bare soil. I'm going to show you this video. Hopefully this works.
I kind of move in all directions once everyone gets photos. If you want to dig with this, that puts you feedback.
That is so cool.
So
Now he's hidden.
horned lizards will do that. They'll shimmy into the soil like that, and they need loose, bare soil in order to do that. You can't have a turf of St. Augustine grass that allows them to do this instinctual behavior that they know how to do from birth. And they will escape the heat and the cold and fire and predators by shimmying into the bare soil. But there's other reasons that the bare soil is important besides camouflage, and that's basking, foraging for insects in the open areas, and also egg laying. They have to have bare soil to do that. And research shows that they won't inhabit areas under 20% native grasses or under 20% bare soil. And the figures are closer to about 37% for bare ground, according to Sarah Vanderleek's thesis that she did. The next one, let's see. Okay, and then the stripe on the back of the horned lizard's back. Texas horn, there's about a dozen or more, dozen to 20 different species of horned lizards. The Texas or the plains horned lizard that we're looking at here, the state reptile of Texas, is the easternmost. It's the prairie species. And all of the Texas horned lizards have this white or off-white stripe that goes down the middle of their back like this. And Wade Sherbrooke, who wrote kind of the field guide on horned lizards, hypothesized back in 2002 that stripe mimics the sun-bleached prairie grass stem litter, the thatch, the previous season's growth that falls to the ground and becomes the thatch. And so that was part of what I tested for my thesis in 2018, and it turns out to be, at least the way that I measured it, turned out to support his hunch. And so that's possibly another reason why prairie grasses, as opposed to some other grass, are important for horned lizards, because their first line of defense against visual predators is to just stay put. They try to look like their surroundings. They're not like, our spiny lizards or our anoles or a lot of these other lizards that we have that can run up a tree or up a fence. They can't do those things. They have to just look like their surroundings in order to defend themselves against predators. That's their first line of defense. And so let's get into this. Let's get into some of these native plants that are important for Texas horned lizards. Bunch grasses. So some good examples are here. You got Texas cutgrass over on the left. That's one that painted buntings seem to favor as well. Of course, little blue stem is just, the prince of the prairie. It's just ubiquitous across the landscape wherever you do have native prairies. And it has this nice kind of Easter basket hay, thatch or previous season's growth down at the bottom, where quails like to lay their eggs on top of that. Horned lizards can get under that during the hot part of the day, or get out of view of a roadrunner or some other predator. Tabosa grass or galleta grasses are also nice little bunch grasses for them if you're out in the panhandle or if you're out in the western part of the state. And there's quite a few more. I mean, there's 469 different native grasses in Texas. Most of them are clump forming bunch grasses. And as I mentioned, quail and other, dick sissels and meadowlarks and other grassland birds require these plants as well. And so again, you need a mosaic of grassland types within feet of each other. And so you can mimic this with the species of plants that you choose. And getting out there and weeding and stuff as well. And this can be adopted on ranches and ranges, and using grazing regimes and prescribed burns. But just a couple years ago at TCU, in the same lab that I was in, there was another horned lizard graduate student researcher that discovered that some alleyways in some of these small Texas towns where Texas horned lizards still exist mimic these habitat mosaics that horned lizards need out on open range, because in the middle of these alleyways in these alleyways, first of all, you have more horned lizards than you do in other parts of these small towns, and in the middle of the alleyway you have sort of these trodden, sometimes mown areas in the 3 to 5 feet in the center there. And then on the outer parts you have a lot of times shrubs and bunch grasses and wildflowers and cactus and weeds that allow them to get out of the heat during the day and escape the odd cat and that sort of thing. And so mimicking that in any way that you can creatively could create habitat in your yard or your ranch or what have you. Okay, so what do Texas horned lizards eat? They eat a lot more than just the big red ants, the big harvester ants that everybody knows about. This was Rachel Alenius's master's research at TCU, and these are all of the things that she found in the fecal pellets of horned lizards, looking at crushed fecal pellets under a microscope and trying to identify the insects that were in them. Yes, there were harvester ants, but that didn't even provide most of the calories. Big-headed ants and harvester termites actually provided most of the calories for Texas horned lizards in this southern part of Texas, in Karnes County. And what are harvester termites, you ask? They're a type of grass, a type of termite that just eats decaying grass matter in the southern half of Texas. And so you have those, and then you've got another thing that was interesting is they eat a lot of beetles, including dung beetles. And to make this story even more compelling, while we were looking at horn lizard, our tracks for surveying horn lizards, we found a horn lizard scat that was being pushed around by a metallic green dung beetle, tumblebug, Canthan viridis. And this is the sequence of him pushing it across the frame there. And you can see all the, this is a crushed fecal pellet with all the red harvester ant pieces or exoskeletons kind of scattered around there in the foreground. But this was interesting because dung beetles are known to disperse native seeds or other seeds when they bury these, when they're rolling around these dung balls and then bury them into the ground. It provides some fertility for the native seeds. They're essentially creating seed balls, and cleaning up the prairie and help that, which also helps with if reduce parasite loads in certain vertebrates, and nutrient cycling. And so it's just kind of mind-blowing to think that horn lizards will eat these dung beetles, but that dung beetles might also be planting this. So, we know that horn lizards eat a lot of ants, and they eat a lot of harvester ants. And what are harvester ants doing? Well, they're carrying around seeds. A lot of those seeds get ingested by horn lizards incidentally. This has been documented. And so it could be that dung beetles, when they're rolling around horn lizard poop and burying it in the ground, they're planting the seeds that the harvester ants prefer that the horn lizards eat. So this is kind of a mind-blowing fact there, or possibility there. Okay, so what do baby horn lizards eat? Well, it turns out some recent research, again from TCU, shows that they eat not harvester ants, because harvester ants are roughly the size of a hatchling horn lizard. They're too big for them. They're eating smaller ant species like acrobat ants or yellow pyramid ants or big-headed ants. Was the Phytale, that was the genus that E.O. Wilson studied, and pavement ants. And so here's just a short video showing a little hatchling horn lizard that we found in Karnes County in an alleyway along a fence, eating Phytale, big-headed ants.
See another one. He's eating the ones that are crawling on him, on his mouth.
These are the priorities, the big headed ones.
There you go. Yeah, or maybe he's just eating the same one.
I'm seeing. It's like go find adult stuff.
I'm trying.
I have no, but
Yeah,
oh, so
he's
forever.
definitely hunting. Wow! Wow!
That was a pretty exciting moment.
Like 30 seconds after capture, it really doesn't stress them out. Huh?
He's back in business.
But yeah, these are just little big-headed ants.
Yeah.
This is me and a couple other graduate students from TCU. But,
Okay, before you pick them up.
all right, you get the idea. But yeah, they're eating smaller ants, and so there's a fecal pellet here of a hatchling horn lizard. They're about the size of a grain of rice. They're smaller, and they always have that little white cap on there. That's the uric acid that you have from birds and reptiles. And then this is to the right of that is next to my hand is a fecal pellet of an adult horn lizard, which they're always kind of cigar shaped like this, and they're really big compared to the size of the animal. And these over here are young horn lizards that were maybe a couple months old, and they had maybe tic tac sized fecal pellets. But again, harvester ants too big for baby hatchling horn lizards to eat. So we have to think beyond just harvester ants. We've got to think, how do we attract all these other native ants? And that seems like a novel question in of itself. How many Texans are looking to attract ants to their property, you know? But I think it's something that we have to think about if we're going to sustain and restore horned lizard populations. All right, another video just showing harvester ants in case you're not familiar with red harvester ants. This is at the Native American Seed Farm in Junction, Texas. That's Bill Neiman talking in the background there. But you can see them carrying seeds from this curly mesquite grass field there. And they're a fairly big ant, you know, maybe more than, you know, maybe 5/8 of an inch long. Okay. Oh, let's see here. Okay, and I mentioned those harvester termites that seem to be the most important part of the diet of horned lizards in South Texas. That was discovered in 2018. This is what these look like. This is also a Native American Seed Farm there, and these were munching on
I think
some fallen piece of eastern gamma grass just out of view. You can see the soldiers there that kind of flank the workers that coming up the middle there. The soldiers have this sprayer nozzle on their head. Essentially their head is a sprayer nozzle, and they spray a noxious chemical at any ants that try to attack the harvester termites. They don't do any damage to human edifices, as far as I know. They just eat grass. Yeah.
Advisor at TCU, so he knows what they are.
All right, and this is a harvester ant mound. You know, they're usually several feet across. Some of the plants that tend to grow along the edge of the rings of the harvester ant mounds are purple threon for whatever reason. I don't know if ants collect them, and the seeds are just so large and spindly, and
Yeah.
they can't get them into the hole. But they call it ant rice, purple threon, maybe for that reason. And I've seen prickly poppy growing around the rings of harvester ant mounds. A couple others that seem to be often growing around these structures. So, what kind of grasses do harvester ants seem to like, and harvester termites? And what kind of grasses can you put out there to kind of mimic those grazed or short grass areas? Well, I think grommas are really good ones because most of them stay pretty short. Texas grommas are a good short one. Side-oats gromma gets a little bit bigger, but you got blue gromma. That one stays pretty short except for the seed stalk. Hooded windmill is another really good grass that stays fairly short. That goes to seed several times a year. So harvester ants are going to benefit from that, which is going to benefit the horned lizards. But you've got blue gromma over here on the right, and there's a lot of bare ground in between the root crowns there. A horned lizard could be happy in that. It wouldn't be happy in a yard of Bermuda grass or St. Augustine or zoysia, most likely, because it's just too dense for them to be able to get through. And I think the harvester ants like the seeds of all of these species. And then I think it's important to plant plants that attract aphids, because we know that aphids are often attended by ants because they like to extract the honeydew that the aphids secrete. And any other kind of, so milkweeds are great probably for horned lizard habitat for that reason, because they seem to support so many different aphids on them. And then when you start looking into the literature for what kind of plants have a direct association with the food webs or the habitat of native ants of the prairie, these are some of the ones that come up quite a bit for different species of ants. And so goldenrods, you know, I'm sure a lot of you already know that those are a keystone species for pollinators and other insects in general. But yeah, you see goldenrod, solidago, and in the literature for supporting a diverse array of prairie ants of the southern Great Plains. And then in the middle there, we've got scrambled eggs or Corydalis. Those have on the seeds, they have elaiosomes on the seeds, which are these little fatty cap that's on the seed coat. And you might have heard the phrase myrmecochory, or how certain seeds are dispersed by ants and then discarded because they'll feed that little fatty cap to the ant larvae and discard the seed, and then the plant grows just fine. And so Corydalis is often growing in the cracks of sidewalks because ants are often nesting in there. But any plants that have elaiosomes on their seed coats directly benefit native ants. And so I think we could start thinking, well, what are the plants that support native ants? Well, these are maybe some of them. Partridge pea is another one because they have extrafloral nectaries growing along the stem. And so any plants that have extrafloral nectaries seem to be important in the ecology, the food web ecology of native ants. These are like little bowls of nectar that ants are always extracting sugars from, and then defending the plant as well from herbivores. Okay, and if you're going to pick, wildflowers to grow, maybe double up on or choose species that are native to your ecoregion, of course, and to your native soils. But maybe select ones that form like a bouquet, kind of like this skull cap over here, or they might confer some kind of protection against birds or mammals that are trying to stick their nose and trying around in the brush to find young horned lizards to eat. Like prickly poppy probably does ward off a few horned lizards predators, and it also attracts a lot of beetles around it. Sleepy daisy back there, and that you can see in the background, forms a nice little bouquet. And so these provide a lot of shade, a lot of seeds, and bring around a lot of insects. And so those are all things that horned lizards need. Just a couple examples there. As far as trees, so you're trying to find out, which ecoregion you're in, and try to find the plants that are typical, the native plants that are typical for your area, but are more typical for the grasslands for your ecoregion. So try to find out what those species are. And as far as trees, you want them to be about as far apart as, players in a baseball diamond or a softball diamond. You don't want them to be too dense, because you stop having essentially a grassland, you start having something like a savanna or a woodland, which isn't the ideal habitat for horned lizards. But if you can think of any species that support ants, anaqua trees in the southern half of Texas seem to be favored by harvester ants. They'll be seen carrying their fruits around, and Eve's necklace brings around a lot of insects as well. You can kind of just go with what supports insects and is native to your area. You don't have to be too selective there, I don't think. But okay, so as I mentioned before, I worked at Native American Seed for a couple of years, and one of my goals while I was there, and I worked with San Antonio Zoo folks, their horned lizard restoration group. And Jason Singhurst even looked at this. He looked at this mix when we were working on it. But I think a lot of folks, they love horned lizards. They remember seeing them when they were kids. They want to know how they can help them. And I thought a commercially available seed mix that has a lot of diversity in there, that touches on some of these things like elaiosomes, extrafloral nectaries, a diverse array of native bunch grasses, would be a good idea for the average person who doesn't necessarily understand that you can't have San Augustine and Bermuda grass and still have horned lizards in your yard. And so this mix, when it first came out, I think it had 73 species. I think it's up to 83 species now. But it has, I think, 50 some odd wildflowers and 33 grasses, all native to Texas. That's a commercial mix, so it's not going to be the perfect answer in horn-nosed restoration, but it's certainly a lot better than some grass from Africa, and it gets the diversity going. It gets the insects coming. It can support harvester ants and other ants and beetles, and it's a good placeholder until you can collect some local ecotype seeds and use those. So what does a yard look like that has horn lizards? Well, this is out in the Trans-Pecos. This is in Brewster County in Alpine, but you can see that there's some grama grasses in the open, short, like walking ways there, with bare soil and rock, and most importantly, soil probably. And then you've got some taller weeds and agaves and cacti along the fence lines. And this yard has horn lizards in it. I've been there and I've seen the evidence. And so maybe something to kind of mimic there, even though this is not going to be the same for Salado as far as the natives that you're using. You can kind of try to mimic that. And looking on the outside of their yard there, one thing we always noticed when we were finding baby horn lizards on our surveys, they had little hatchlings, which can fit on a dime. They're so small, as that practically every single time we found them on mounds of dirt. It could be like infield dirt for just outside of a little league baseball field, or it could be discarded potted plants that somebody was throwing in their alleyway. They're always around loose mounds of soil. And so that seems to be what the kind of place that a mother horn lizard prefers to lay her eggs. And so I thought, well, this could be a useful landscape feature. If you can use a mound of dirt, maybe like a pitcher mound in size, you can plant it with some of these species of plants that seem to be important for the habitat and food web of horn lizards. And so you can put some bunch grasses in there. And this is just a couple examples over here on the left of little blue stem that my partner Lindsay drew in here. On the top part, Texas grama, some shorter grasses, and then something there to protect the babies from being eaten by coyotes or cats or foxes, like something prickly and pokey, like a prickly pear or agarita or a prickly poppy, maybe some milkweeds in there to support the aphids, which supports the ants. Just some ideas there. But this mound that you see there did have these little half moon shaped places where the female horn lizards have been digging in there to lay their eggs. So it was confirmed what I had already seen. All right, so this is another yard down in Karnes County, and the yard here on the left had dozens of horn lizards in it.
Hey, Dusty,
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, our meeting is running out of time. I'm sorry to interrupt you because this is so interesting. But we've got to get going soon. Can you start wrapping up and just give us the BLF, the bottom line up front? I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're almost to the end here. So
Okay.
This yard here on the left had horse herb in it, which and it had a lot of bare space in between the plants. You could mow it on a regular basis. It was shade friendly. It had harvester ant mounds in the yard and horn lizards in it. The one on the right over there had a carpet turf of probably St. Augustine grass. I never saw any horn lizards over there on the right. Saw lots of horn lizards over there on the left. And I won't go into how to do this, but you can get on Web Soil Survey. I have a video showing you how to do that, where you can just draw your property. It'll show your soils. It'll show you what native plants, if you do the ecological site description, what native plants belong on your soils at your property. That could be a good way to do a custom seed mix or start collecting native plants. And I'll just skip over that. All right, so just to wrap things up here, I currently work with the Wildlife Habitat Federation. And so my website, Rehorning Texas, is there to help landowners who want to help horn lizards, but we've basically teamed up to provide some services free of charge to the landowner in Texas who wants to help restore prairies, and in particular to help restore horn lizards. And we will do site visit assessments and create habitat management plans, restoration plans, and then also we do the implementation. So all of that is free, and it's a new thing that we're doing, teaming up with WHF and Rehorning Texas. And so also please support organizations that support those keystone species that I mentioned before. The Prairie Dog Coalition, Texas Tribal Buffalo Project. There's an organization that's trying to restore wolves in Texas. All of these are keystone species that are important for creating horned lizard habitat. And with that, that's it.